good morning. My name is Nick. I'd like to welcome you again to Community Christian Church. Great to be together this morning. In case we haven't had a chance to meet before, I'm a member of Community Christian Church, so my wife and my family and I, we attend church here. I was on staff here at the church for about 7 years until I moved over to doing marriage and family therapy full time. So that's what I do full time. I sit across from couples and individuals and families and try to help them be as healthy as possible. But I love the opportunity when I get a chance to come up and teach or speak, and so I love being able to be here this morning. One of the ways that we organize teaching around here at CCC is in series, right? So we'll talk about different message series, and it's all messages that are around a similar theme or around a similar topic, and we're in the midst of a series called Road Trip, right, where we're focusing on moments from Jesus' life where he has interactions while he's traveling down the road. And in the midst of these interactions, there's some amazing things that happen, some life change that happens. And so we've been looking at these kinds of moments from the life of Jesus. In the last 2 weeks, we've taken a look at Jesus while he was traveling down the road to Jericho. And today we're going to look at another encounter he had while he was on the road. Now, I'm not sure how many miles it has to be before it's officially a road trip. Like, I'm not sure where the cutoff point is. But I don't know about you guys, but once the weather starts turning a little bit warmer and it's a little bit nicer out, like, my mind starts drifting to, like, vacation mode a little bit, or, like, what's coming up for the summer. Does anyone have a road trip planned, like, maybe this year or coming up this summer? Yeah, a bunch of us do, actually. Now, has anyone ever been on a road trip before with kids? Have you ever had a road trip? Yeah. So, it's a different experience, okay? Like, in case you've never had that experience before, it's a little bit different. And what you do when you're on a road trip with kids is you come up with car games, right? You come up with games in the car, right? So we'll play, like, the alphabet game. Anyone play the alphabet game before, right? Yeah, absolutely. So you try to find kind of move through the letters of the alphabet, and it has to be the first letter of the word, okay, guys? Like my kids try to cheat all the time. Like, no, the Q has to be first. It can't be, like, in the word along the way. We'll do trivia sometimes. We'll ask each other trivia questions. So we'll do car bingo. You ever done car bingo before where, like, oh, I see a train or I see a dog. You kind of mark off all the bingo things. I know. Here's a good one in case you haven't played this one before. It's called the quiet game. So, yeah, it's a good one. So what you do with the quiet game is you see who can be quiet the longest. It's a really good game. You can play that in church too if you want. Like, if that's also an option. You can play that here. I know one of the games that we enjoy playing, particularly on longer trips, is we'll do, like, the license plate game, right? So we'll see, right? So you guys know what I'm talking about, right? So you're trying to see, like, how many of the 50 states can we, like, see, or how many different license plates can we see along the way? And I thought, just to prime the pump this morning, to get ourselves moving a little bit, I'm going to show you a license plate without the state name on it. I'm going to see if, based on, like, the color or the design or the slogan, if you guys can guess what state it is. Okay? You can work with the people around you a little bit, like, just to get us rolling. So we'll start off with an easy one here. So what state is this one here from? Delaware. That is Delaware. Absolutely. You'll see that one a bunch around here at different points along the way. All right, how about this one right here? Florida. You can also tell this one because that person doesn't know how to drive. So that's just another tip off that person's from Florida there as well. All right, how about this one? Hawaii, you're right. A little bit slower on that one. You probably haven't seen as many of those along the way. How about this one here? What do you think? That is Alaska. I think I've only ever seen, like, one or two of these in, like, real life in the wild. Like, you don't see these a lot in the wild anymore around here. How about this one here? New York, right? They drive as well as the Florida people do. They're kind of in that same bin. All right, maybe this one's a little bit harder, possibly. Arizona, you're right. I think there's a couple states that might be the Grand Canyon state, but that is Arizona. How about this one? A couple different answers there. That is actually Illinois. That is Illinois here. All right, how about this one? Is this one more challenging for you guys? Sportsman's Paradise. That is Louisiana. Maybe you're, like, shooting gators. Like, I'm not exactly sure. Like I don't really know. I don't really know about that one. All right, how about this one here? It's an old one. We're going to throw back a little bit here. That one is California. Yeah, now, it's an interesting thing, right? Because when you're driving down the road, particularly when you're on a longer trip, like, if you don't pay attention to stuff, you'll miss stuff, right? Like, if you don't keep your eyes open, if you're not looking around, you'll miss some things. The whole point of this series is let's not miss these little moments in the life of Jesus. Let's not miss these little moments and these interactions that he had on the road. And today, the road we're going to look at that Jesus was traveling was honestly not a road he seemed to plan to walk, right? This isn't some kind of like planned trip. This is not like a journey. This is like an impromptu road that Jesus finds himself on. And so to set the stage, Jesus is at his friend's house, and he's having a meal. He's having a conversation. So Jesus is at Matthew's house, and Matthew is a tax collector. And last week, David talked a little bit about the relationship between kind of Jewish religious folks and tax collectors. So if you didn't get a chance to listen to that, make sure you check that out. It really talks through a little bit about that dynamic. But the Jewish leaders did not like tax collectors, right? Like, they were not a fan of each other. And so Jesus being at the house of a tax collector and having a meal with a tax collector and having a conversation with a tax collector, they weren't a fan of that either, right? And so here Jesus is. He's hanging out. He's answering some questions. He's talking about what does it look like to live a life that's pleasing to God, about the kingdom of heaven. And this story that we're going to look at this morning, it's in 3 different books of the Bible. It's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We'll jump between them just a little bit. But this is where we're going to start in Matthew 9. So Jesus is teaching. This is what it says. While he was saying this, a synagogue leader came and knelt before him and said, "My daughter has just died, but come and put your hands on her, and she will live." Jesus got up and went with him, and so did his disciples. So in this scene, Jesus is speaking and he's teaching, and in bursts a synagogue leader. Right? So this is a leader of the Jewish faith. And he rushes in, and he kneels before Jesus, and he says, "My daughter is sick to the point of death." That's another way of translating that. Some of the other translations will not say, "My daughter has died." It says, "My daughter is like right on the edge of death." Like she's dying. But if you come, I believe that if you come and you touch her, that she'll live. You can almost picture it, right? Kind of maybe a quieter room. People are listening to what Jesus is saying. And then there's this huge interruption. In bursts into the room this father who is desperate for help for his daughter. And we learn this father's name is Jairus. And even all this animosity that exists between Jesus and the Jewish leaders, it's set aside for Jairus because he's desperate and there's urgency. And the love of his daughter has driven him to the place where he's like, no, I'm willing to take this step. So Jairus seeks out Jesus for help because he believes that might be the only place he can get help. So Jesus responds and he gets up and he follows him. And Jesus' teaching is interrupted, and he heads out on the road to Jairus' house to help Jairus' daughter. And this trip wasn't a vacation. This wasn't like a pre-planned destination. This isn't like a grand entrance to a city. It's not something you'd like travel blog about. This was Jesus walking from one house to another house. And I think we spend most of our lives on the road to Jairus' house. It might not have this kind of urgency. It might not be to rescue a friend, but most of our lives are not spent on the large roads. They're not spent on these huge named roads. They're spent on smaller roads, aren't they? The road to work, the road to home, the road to family, the road to school, the road to friends, the road to church. Whether it's literal or metaphorical, our lives exist on the smaller daily roads. And so Jesus heads out on a regular old road to travel to the house of Jairus. And on the way, Jesus isn't walking alone. Right at this point, Jesus has some reputation. And everyone's like curious about like, how is this going to play out? Right? Jairus is a really important guy. He's a leader. He kind of demands respect from his position at the synagogue. And so this crowd begins following along the road to Jairus' house. We read this: "A large crowd followed and pressed around him." So now, not only was Jesus' teaching interrupted so he can go to the road to Jairus' house, he's stuck in traffic. Right? Like, the crowd's pressing in. It's slowing everything down. I wonder what this is like for Jairus. I wonder what it's like for Jairus that the crowd is pushing in, that the progress is slowing. And now we have another character that enters the story, and this is what we read. "And a woman who was there had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak because she thought, if I can just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. So in the crush of people in this crowd, there's a woman who's been suffering from bleeding for over a decade, and she sees Jesus, and she's desperate. She spent every penny she had on being healed, but instead it just keeps getting worse and worse, and the bleeding won't stop. And on top of that, Jewish ceremonial law would have said that because of her bleeding, she was unclean, which meant she wasn't allowed to go into the temple. She wasn't allowed into Jewish religious ceremonies. Jewish law also said that anyone she touched became unclean as well. It's almost like she was covered in mud, and everything she touched became unclean. Everything she touched was spoiled. Imagine the impact that would have on your family, on your relationships. So here's a desperate woman, and she's been cut off from her relationships. She's been cut off from her faith. She's been told that she's unclean, and she hears Jesus coming down the road, and she thinks, I'm going to take a shot. I'm going to take a shot. I'm going to try to sneak up to him. If I could just touch his clothes, I think it might heal me. Like, I'm going to take a shot. And so she reaches out, and she touches his clothes, and she's healed. And she knows it immediately. And she's trying to be sneaky here. She's trying to be subtle. She's trying to get like a little like private healing in that no one has to know about. But no such luck, because this is what we read. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my clothes? Right, so Jesus knows something's happened. He knows that power has gone out from him. And he's like, whoa, who touched me? And his disciples are like incredulous. They're like, you see the people crowding against you? His disciples answered, and you can ask who touched me? It's like, Jesus, everyone's touching you, man. It's like when you leave a Ravens game and everyone's like an inch from each other and you're just like, it's like, what do you mean who touched you? Like, who's not touching you, man? Like, we're like in a cattle chute here. But that wasn't enough for Jesus. Jesus was not content with the answer of, there's a lot of people here. This is what we read. But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. Jesus is teaching, and he's interrupted by Jairus. On the way to Jairus' house, he is slowed by the crowd. And then his interruption is interrupted by a woman who is bleeding. Except Jesus doesn't seem to view these as interruptions at all. Not in the slightest. Jesus seems to think that it is important to treat people like they matter. Seems to treat people like maybe that's the whole point after all. And he takes time to find out who touched him. He stops so he can find out who touched him. And it says when she came to him, she told him the whole truth. He had time to stop and hear her story. He had time to look her in the eye and to call her daughter. An interruption of an interruption of an interruption. But for Jesus, he doesn't see them as interruptions. He sees it as an opportunity to do the work of God and to express God's love to someone who's hurting. And while Jesus might not have seen this as an interruption, I can only imagine what Jairus is experiencing. The delay, the slowdown, another interruption by this unclean poor woman. And it's in this moment that Jairus' servants come and they arrive on the road. We read this. While Jesus was still speaking, some people from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader, said, your daughter is dead, they said. Why bother this teacher anymore? So Jairus gets the news that he's been dreading, that his daughter is no longer sick to the point of death. She's dead. She's no longer holding on to the edge of life. It is tipped into death. The delays, the interruptions, how slow they were, how slow God was moving. But Jesus says, don't be afraid, just believe. They keep traveling down the road, and finally they arrive at Jairus' house, and this must have felt like the longest road Jairus has ever walked in his life. And they arrive at his house, and everyone's grieving, and Jesus ushers everyone out except for Jairus, Jairus' wife, and 3 of his disciples. Then we read this. Jesus took her by the hand, and he said to her, Talitha koum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. You see, the interruptions and the delays could not stop the work of God. It couldn't even slow it down. Nothing could stop God's expression of his love to this family and to this little girl. Now, the difference between these two characters are significant. Jairus is the leader of a synagogue, a much respected, influential member of the community. He held a position that offered him power, wealth, respect, admiration. The poor woman, on the other hand, was a social pariah. Her affliction that she endured for 12 long years cut her off from everything. The writers of the gospel seem to kind of further highlight her marginalization, her alienization, because we know Jairus' name, we don't know hers. But for all intents and purposes, she was a nobody. But what they had in common was they were both desperate and they realized they were powerless. They realized the only hope they had was found in Jesus. So both of them, they took a chance, or they both took a shot, and they learned something that I hope all of us remember today as well. Jesus is interruptible. It's an interesting word to assign to the Son of God, isn't it? But Jesus never seemed to see people as interruptions. To Jesus, people were the whole point. And this is different from how our world works. In our world, if you're important, if you're powerful, if you're influential, those people are not available. Those people are not interruptible. Very much the opposite. Except Jesus is teaching, and he's saying some really important things, and he sets it all aside to help a person. And Jesus is walking down the road on an important task, and he stops to make sure he's engaging with a hurting person. Maybe you've never considered it before, but Jesus is so completely interruptible so that he could display God's deep and full availability to us. Maybe that's the part of the story you need to hear this morning. Maybe this is the reminder you need, is that God is amazingly available to us. You are not an interruption to God. Your pain is not an interruption to God. God is available to all of us. People are not interruptions to God because people are the point. And Jesus did such a masterful job of handling these interruptions. And so Jairus, this powerful leader, realizes he needs Jesus. So he interrupts Jesus, and Jesus responds. And the woman who is bleeding, she needs a powerful healing because nothing else is working. She's desperate. She needs help. She comes to Jesus, and Jesus stops, and he hears her story, and he calls her daughter, and she walks away healed. Jesus did a masterful job of handling these interruptions, but I wonder how well we do. You see, the road to Jairus' house, it's full of interruptions, isn't it? Things that go outside of our plans, things that slow us down, things that don't go the way we expect. I mean, road to Jairus' house sometimes is nothing but interruptions. I think many of us would really agree with and celebrate this writing by Charles Spurgeon. Charles Spurgeon wrote this about the sovereignty and the power of God. This is what he wrote. I believe that every particle of dust that dances in the sunbeam does not move an atom more or less than God wishes. That every particle of spray that dashes against the steamboat has its orbit, as well as the sun in the heavens. That the chaff from the hand of the winnower is steered as the stars in their course. Or the idea that every teeny tiny atom is steered just as surely as the stars in the galaxy. That God's hand is in motion to steer and direct and to guide all things. And we cheer this because when we are reminded of the power and the might and the foresight of God, even in the smallest things. Yet I wonder if we still cheer when those dust particles in the sunbeams interrupt our days. When our coworker knocks on our door right when we're feeling most productive. When our toddler decides to exercise their lung capacity in the middle of the grocery store. When our parent calls because they just can't connect to Netflix. When the person who said they're going to be there and they're going to help you and they cancel. God might be in charge of the dust motes and he might be in charge of the galaxies, but I think he let this one slip because this is not my plan. This is not what I wanted. God must have let that one slip through the cracks. Except anyone who reads the Bible would be able to tell you that efficiency is not one of God's primary goals. I will say that again in case you were thinking in multitasking and you missed it. Efficiency does not seem to be one of God's highest goals. Instead, God's goals seem to be us living out our faith in love. So what do we do with delays? Regularly, even if subconsciously, we walk into our days with efficiency as our agenda. Fold the laundry, write the paper, cook the meals, balance the budget, get the kids showered, go for a jog, go to bed with no task left unchecked. I want all my tasks checked off. And yet God's agenda for us is not efficiency, but paying attention to his movement so we can have our faith expressed in love. But this is often a significant challenge when loving other people means tolerating with patience and kindness and gentleness the interruptions of our lives, because those interruptions might be what God is calling us into. And while we might want to move through our plans without interruptions, God longs for us to trust him with the interruptions because he might be guiding our lives. And I want to confess something for a minute here. I'm terrible at this. Just want to be just real up front. I am a total hypocrite at this, okay? I know this is the better way to live. I know that this is what we are called to. And I know it, except when we're running behind and the plans aren't going the way I need them to, and I would like to be there by now, and it's just so uncomfortable, and I don't like it. Except all of us are called to manage our discomforts in light of our faith of God. All of us are called to view our interruptions not as something that is going against my plan, but an invitation for my plan to fold into the plan of God. Because these interruptions are often invitations into the awareness of the movement of God. How often do we see that interruptions are an invitation into the awareness of the movement of God? Now, I think we need to draw an important distinction here. There's a difference between interruptions and distractions. Those are different things. Because a lot of us have trained ourselves to listen very, very closely to the notifications and the alerts and the messages on our pocket supercomputer without realizing that it makes us often very uninterruptible. Interruptions such as these, they don't normally strengthen our faith. They don't normally strengthen our ability to love better. In fact, they sometimes do the very opposite. Instead of propelling us into a life where we can love our neighbor, sometimes it propels us into a life that's full of skimming and multitasking and critiquing and complaining and entertaining ourselves. Instead of inviting ourselves to cast our burdens on God, we feed this low-level anxiety constantly, like we're trying to maintain this mild fever. And yet too often, I will resent the interruption that my neighbor has to me while I relish the interruption my phone has. And so I hope that we can make a really good distinction between an interruption and a distraction. There may be some times where you have to turn off the notifications on your phone for long stretches of your day. Maybe you decide the exact moment you're going to check your emails and not a moment before. When you go to sleep, perhaps maybe well before you go to sleep, maybe your phone needs to go to sleep too. Whatever it takes, can you cultivate the kind of calm and focused mind that is ready to receive interruptions? Because it's so easy to get our wires crossed here. That the interruption God has for our attention can shift into just what are the distractions that I enjoy. But maybe growing in the awareness of this isn't enough. Maybe we need to take a really practical step of how do we become more prepared toward welcoming the interruption God sends. And one way we have to do it is we have to leave margin in our schedule. Right? Margin is the edges of the paper. It is the shoulder of the road. Perhaps many of us find interruptions so frustrating because we simply have no margin. Every interruption means something is spilling over. Every interruption means something that I thought was going to happen doesn't, because there's no space. There's no room for it. And again, I stink at this. I'm often so tempted to put appointment by appointment and task on top of task on top of task. And next thing you know, an interruption means that things are spilling over. If you've ever driven on a road with no shoulder, it is an uncomfortable experience, particularly when you're driving on a cliff. But how laughably arrogant is it for me or for us to think that God's job is to rubber stamp my plans for today as opposed to being mindful of what's God's plans for today. And it's stressful to live a life without margin, without any space for God to move. But look how Jesus handles these interruptions. Is he frustrated? Is he annoyed? Is he flustered? Does he seem rushed? Over and over again in the Bible accounts of the life of Jesus, we see someone who allows space for interruptions. I've sometimes heard these moments called divine appointments. Right? These moments and these encounters and the interactions that God has put on your calendar, you just don't know it yet. God put them on your to-do list, you just aren't aware of it. Do you have time for any divine appointments in your life, or are you just too busy? You see, Jesus displays this amazing patience, Not only because he's the Son of God, but because he had healthy, sane realism to expect interruptions and to leave room for them in his life so that he could love his neighbor. How many times are we irritated because, unlike Jesus, we have no space, we have no margin? If that's the case, if that's something that you wrestle with, then maybe the invitation for today is to plan some space, to plan some margin. I think sometimes we are tempted to pray for patience, but we leave no room for patience to exist. Those who trust deeply in the sovereignty and the power of God, we have to learn to leave enough room for God's sovereignty to work. You see, through interruptions, God, he often exposes our pride, slows us down, opens our eyes. It bends us toward dependence into him. It teaches us to trust. It teaches us how to love other people in his names. It reminds us that he is not after our maximum efficiency. He's interested in our lives, living out our faith in love. You see, Jesus was never too busy or preoccupied or too important to be interrupted. So maybe today is a challenge for you to create some space for a divine appointment. Maybe this upcoming week you set aside some spaces so that you're interruptible. You see, the road to Jairus is full of interruptions. But fortunately, Jesus walks the road to Jairus with us. And maybe you feel like you're on the road to Jairus right now. Maybe you have pain and you have hurt and you wish God would just hurry up a little bit. Or maybe you have pains and you have hurts and you're just kind of holding on to them. Whether because you mistakenly think that you're so important like Jairus, or whether you mistakenly think God would never do anything for someone like you. Jesus came to earth to reveal who God was and who God is. To reveal that through the interruptibility, what Jesus is displaying is God's availability. Jesus comes to show us that God not only longs for us to ask and to reach out, God longs to enter into our stories. And maybe today is an opportunity for that for you as well. Maybe today is a chance to bring some of your hurts, to ask for some healing to this amazingly interruptible God. Every time we gather together, we have an opportunity to do that. Right? One of the ways that we remember God's availability is through communion. What we do in communion is that we remember that God held nothing back for us. There's nothing that God didn't hold back that wouldn't keep us from being available to us. And so we kind of replay a meal that Jesus shared with his disciples. There was a time right before Jesus was crucified where he took some bread and he broke it and he said, "This is my body that's broken for you." And he took some wine and he passed it and he said, "This is my blood that is poured out for you for the forgiveness of sins." And so we have a little mini replay of that. When we eat some bread to remember the body of Jesus that was given up freely for us, we drink some juice to remember the blood of Jesus that was spilled so that we could be healed, so that we could be invited into the family of God. So there's cups in the back of the room that has the bread and the juice in it. If you didn't grab one of those on the way in, feel free to grab those in just a minute. And we're going to take some time to remember that God is available to us. And so he calls us to be available to others as well. Let's pray together. God, we thank you that you walk the road of Jairus. We're so thankful that you are available in ways that we can't even understand. And I pray that each and every one of us would remember that you long for us to bring our hurts and our pains and our fears to you. And that your love knew no bounds. That you were willing to give up everything, including your son, to show us that love. And I pray that in a response to that, we will also show your love to others. That we would not be so consumed with ourselves and our plans that we would miss opportunities to express that love to other people. And I pray that in this time, that in this space, we'd be able to slow down and turn our eyes towards you so that we can walk the road that you call us to walk. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
I don't even know where that came